I'm going to say something that is often considered blasphemous among the Pokemon community, and that is the fact that the second generation of Pokemon has always been my least favorite. At least it was until recently, when I gave it another shot. In fact, before recording footage for this video, I had never actually completed the whole game, usually stopping in the later gyms of Johto. I've owned all three games on Game Boy since their release, but for some reason when I was younger I was just so opposed to changes that seemed to stray from Pokemon Red and Blue, my favorite childhood games. I remember explicitly thinking that the new games looked too dark due to the actual addition of color palettes and saturation, obvious improvements in terms of technology, but my little 4-year-old brain didn't want that, because it was not the Pokemon games that I had come to know. I eventually did play the Soul Silver remaster several years later, and figured that the original versions probably deserved a fair shot as well. Looking at Pokemon Gold and Silver these days, and by association Pokemon Crystal, it's painfully obvious how many of my favorite additions to the later Pokemon games actually originated during the second generation. These turn of the millennium Pokemon titles were meant to be the final handheld Pokemon experience, and a loving send-off to the franchise that Nintendo assumed would soon be biting the dust. But let's see how they improved the series so much to keep it afloat and beloved to this very day as we unravel what's so great about Pokemon's second generation. Nintendo and Game Freak have definitely continued to change things up every so often in the Pokemon series, especially within the last few generations. But each entry tends to have a handful of unique features that don't quite get off the ground well enough to justify becoming a staple in the series. Pokemon Gold and Silver, however, possibly have the most changes to the franchise in terms of new features that would become a standard in every following entry. So let's talk about a few of these features that we may forget were not always around until the second generation introduced them to us. The first notable addition, in fact, the player even has to enact this one, is the addition of a working clock and day-night cycle. The day-night cycle was dropped temporarily by the third generation, but has since returned in every following entry, as far as my memory serves. And even the third generation still used an internal clock for the growth of player-planted berries and weekly events in the game's overworld. The importance of the day and night cycle facilitated a much more natural approach to the Pokemon creatures' availability and interaction with the player. These are supposed to be living creatures that inhabit the worlds of these pocket-sized universes, so of course any fully realized creature would have schedules and habits. Some would be nocturnal, or more commonly seen at dawn. Someone in your path on your first errand out of your hometown even mentions that certain Pokemon appear in the morning, suggesting you keep in mind the time of day as you try to fill your Pokedex. The next series addition actually applies in a few stages of deeper and deeper gameplay. The surface level would be the addition of genders to Pokemon. This doesn't really mean much to your average player, other than maybe they can collect a certain gender of a Pokemon that they like. Beyond that though, this allowed for breeding of Pokemon, an important addition for competitive players and general Pokemon fanatics alike. Breeding between Pokemon of different species and groups allows for interesting player-designed combinations of stats and moves, and in later generations, passive abilities as well. And of course, if there's breeding, then that also means the introduction of baby Pokemon, like Pichu and Cleffa, as well as Pokemon eggs. Without even testing the breeding feature themselves, players are introduced to this new concept when they are handed an egg of an unknown Pokemon very early in their adventure. If they walk around long enough with the egg in their party, it will hatch into the new second generation Pokemon, Togepi. This allowed everyone to have a brand new, one-of-a-kind Pokemon, much like players who discovered where to find Eevee in the first generation of games. Togepi is a tricky Pokemon to utilize well, but also presents the concept of a Pokemon evolving by something other than leveling up, trading, or the use of an item, and that new method of evolving is happiness, a concept that feels at home in a franchise about making new friends along your adventure. Another big change to the Pokemon universe was a nearly complete overhaul of combat, or at least how it's presented to and understood by the player. For instance, one thing that players might not recognize about the first generation of Pokemon was how lopsided some types were in their advantages over others. For instance, the most glaring examples would be how the Psychic and Dragon types fit into everything. Let's start with Psychic. These days, in the most recent releases, Psychic is weak to Bug, Ghost, and Dark type attacks, representing the impact of these three primal fears on the human psyche. First off, Dark type was not around in the first generation. Bug type had 3 damaging moves, which happened to be some of the weakest attacks in the whole game, and 2 of which could only be learned by Beedrill and, oddly enough, Jolteon. Ghost type had only 2 damaging moves, but one of those, Nightshade, did a set amount of damage, no matter the opposing Pokemon's type. And due to a mistake in the coding, the other Ghost type attack was actually completely ineffective against Psychic type defenders. To drive this fumble home, the only family of Ghost type Pokemon would be the Ghastly line, which had a secondary type of poison, actually making them super weak against Psychic types. So, to sum up, unless you had a Beedrill that was severely overleveled, then you're going to have to brute force any Psychic Pokemon you came across, keeping in mind there were 2 gyms chock full of Psychic foes. Dragon type had a similar problem with how it was overlooked in implementation. The Dragon Pokemon are boasted about as some of the most powerful of all Pokemon. However, there were only 3 Dragon Pokemon in the first generation, the Dragonite family, and there was exactly 1 Dragon-type move, which only did a set amount of damage no matter your foe. This means that Dragon-type Pokemon were super effective against nothing, but they could easily be cleaned up with the appropriately armed Ice-type. When the second generation came around, all of this was fixed. Bug and Ghost were given some brand new attacks, some of which were quite powerful and useful, and Dragon-type Pokemon were given at least a few more options as well. And of course, there were now more Pokemon with each of these types to utilize and balance with each other. On top of that was the addition of the Dark and Steel types, the only new type additions until 6th generation introduced Fairy type 13 years later. Dark was a new special attack based type with effectiveness against Psychic and Ghost, shaking things up a bit more in that ethereal battlefront. And Steel was a poison resistant, high defense type that blended well with the other earthy types of Rock and Ground. Both of these new types came loaded with multiple Pokemon that utilized them, as well as a decent array of attacks off the bat, being properly mixed into the fray with the classic Pokemon balancing act. Beyond all of this metagame mumbo-jumbo was a cleaner, more thorough way of displaying all of this information to the player in and out of combat. The most glaring and relieving addition would probably be the experience bar under your Pokemon's stats, allowing players to see how close a Pokemon is to leveling up, without going by an arbitrary number in their individual stats page. Wild Pokemon also had a little indicator to let you know that you had already caught a Pokemon of that species. Each of your party members' attacks are also listed with descriptions and base attack power for a better understanding of their uses beyond the trial and error approach of the first generation. These moves could also be reordered to simplify things in battle depending on a player's playstyle. Combat also had a few little changes here and there that made it flow a little smoother and be a little less frustrating to the player, such as the fact that a Pokemon could still attack while it was wrapped by an opponent, or immediately after waking up. Both of these scenarios could cause some aggravating situations in the earlier games. There's a lot more player freedom in terms of adventuring towards areas that are accessible to you even if you haven't completed the main objectives in a certain town. For instance, upon reaching Goldenrod City, even without defeating the gym or really exploring the town at all, you're completely free to just make a beeline to the North Gate and continue on to multiple new routes and the bug catching park, taking your time to explore, train, and catch new Pokemon beyond the city limits. In the first generation, there were a lot more instances of impassable obstacles without the access of a new HM, or toll booth guards turning you away. Removal of the Sudowoodo blocking your path early on allows for faster travel between early game stages, unlike Gen 1, where your best bet at getting back to the early towns was by waiting until you get Fly, or taking the Diglett Tunnel, which even then was a bit of a nuisance and still left you with either Viridian Forest or Mount Moon to go through to get to Pewter City's adjacent towns. Along with the freedom to explore future routes without fully clearing a city, you have plenty of opportunity to scout ahead and clear out other areas before taking on bigger story-based objectives, such as gyms or other big focuses of each town like the Burned Tower in Ecruteak or the Lighthouse in Olivine. The only qualifier in your exploration is whenever you decide you're through with your current area of interest and would like to explore somewhere else. This may require you to go defeat a gym, for instance to be able to use an HM like Surf, but then even more of the world is open to you. Additionally, Gold and Silver were the first games to really provide players with the opportunity to find hidden rewards just out of sight but still within cities. The second generation of Pokemon games feel a bit more like open world experiences due to the addition of back alley style areas across small lakes and ponds that may just seem like parts of the surrounding landscape or Nintendo's form of invisible walls. But if you think about your surroundings, you may realize how many chances you have to find new paths and new collectibles. One addition to the second generation in terms of items your Pokemon can interact with is the addition of held items. Sure, this means a Pokemon can heal itself slightly mid-battle, but it also allows for more strategizing in terms of which items a player hands to their Pokemon. It feels like a bit of a mission to find the different stat-boosting held items throughout the world. This makes the concept of held items more interesting than just a way to give your Pokemon an extra 10 health in battle. In later games, the held items are pretty much thrown at you from every direction, sometimes even super powerful, whole game simplifying trump cards. But in the second generation, trying to find the limited number of items like charcoal, black belt, and other collectibles for each member of your team keeps up the incentive to talk to everyone and check every corner. Pokemon Gold and Silver had a nice way of covering the bases and making sure you face Pokemon of every type in battle. The gyms of Johto use all of the types that weren't used in the first game's gyms, aside from the new Dark type, which is reserved more for appearances from the game's returning villains, Team Rocket. Then, of course, once you get to visit Kanto, you'll face updated versions of all of those classic gyms. In the first generation of Pokemon games, the levels of your opponents at Indigo Plateau range from level 53 to 65, the strongest Pokemon you'll find anywhere in the game. However, once you've beaten them, you're done in terms of a combat challenge, even though all of your Pokemon can continue leveling up to level 100. There just wasn't a point for such a high level cap when your opponents stopped halfway up the ladder. And honestly, there wasn't really a point for that level cap for a few generations until features like Battle Tower and other optional competitions came into play. But in the second generation of Pokemon games, the trainers at Indigo Plateau range in level from just 40 to 50, with the strongest Pokemon you face at Indigo Plateau being 3 levels lower than the weakest in Red and Blue versions. I was confused by this when I was initially playing because not only does it feel like the Elite Four is just sprung on you right after collecting the 8th badge, but it feels like it's too soon in terms of progress of developing your team. I was still evolving some of my team members while fighting the Elite Four. But what this early challenge does for the player is provide more incentive for continuing after beating it, as it's partnered with a great aspect of timing in terms of revealing to the player how much still lies ahead. As you initially head towards your awaiting challengers at the Indigo Plateau, you'll be stopped by a bystander who alerts you to the fact that you've just taken your first steps into the Kanto region, the area in which the first generation of games takes place. If you open your map on this route, you'll realize you're no longer on the Johto map, but are now in the bottom corner of a very familiar world you explored throughout your journeys in the first generation of games. However, there are some slight differences in the map's layout, as well as the fact that if you attempt to explore further into Kanto, you'll be blocked by a guard in front of the path you would need to take. He doesn't mention anything about continuing down that way, but just that the Elite Four is waiting for you. All of this culminating at once, the revealed map of Kanto, the blocked path, the empty passage of Victory Road, and the early fight with low-level champions, all point to a singular fact that this is not the end of your journey. Rather, it's just a checkpoint. From the context clues sprinkled around your adventure so far, we understand that the second generation of Pokemon games takes place 3 years after the first generation, even in the same canonical timeline, which is an infrequent concept among many Nintendo franchises. But this prompts the idea of us players to consider what's changed in the last 3 years. We know that Team Rocket is scattered, there are new Pokemon out there already discovered as well as still to be discovered, and we've even seen some familiar faces in characters like Professor Oak, Bill, Lance the Dragon Trainer, and previous gym leader Koga. So who else is still up to their old routines in Kanto, and who's changed things up? Well, once you have defeated the Elite Four, you'll get a chance to see it yourself. Stepping into Kanto allows you to take the role of a tourist, seeing what's new, what's different, and how it all compares to the first half of your journey so far. The Kanto roads and paths generally have the same catch lists, so trainers who are familiar with the region of Kanto can make quick work of tracking down Pokemon that they're missing. Here's also a little piece of side trivia for a man whose contributions to Nintendo should always be remembered and applauded. During development, Game Freak wasn't even sure they could fit all of the Johto region and its features on the Game Boy cartridges, but the late great Satoru Iwata managed to do some coding magic that virtually doubled the amount of content that could be squeezed into the game, effectively single-handedly being the reason for players' ability to visit Kanto at all. All of this talk of changes has also gone without mentioning the single most obvious difference between the first and second generations, and that is the addition of full color. This brought a new amount of energy to the world, with deep green forests and dark brown caves, and of course, it made the Pokemon really pop. Even returning species have been given much cleaner sprites, even more so than the updated Pokemon Yellow designs. This new addition of detail and energy isn't even considering the fact that in Pokemon Crystal, each monster had a little animation at the beginning of a battle. All of the Pokemon, new and old, look so much more detailed and much more like themselves with the additional color palette capabilities of the Game Boy Color. Even if you put the first generation games into Game Boy Color, the majority of the games are spent either in red or blue palettes, with Yellow version having fully colored Pokemon, but the problem is they could only use 3 colors, 2 of which were different hues of the same color, and then the third being black, and technical use of transparent pixels for white. But in the second generation, the difference in design comes from the fact that the 2 colors other than black and white don't have to be different shades of a singular color. The simple fact that they could change a single color made so much more of a difference in the character designs of both people and Pokemon and really brought this game to life. Looking back on these Pokemon games, it's clear to see how Game Freak intended them to be the conclusive Pokemon experience, with updates and balances to combat, the introduction of rematches through the Pokegear and the brand new shiny Pokemon, and so many other additions here and there demonstrating how this truly became the foundation for the rest of the series moving onwards. It's hard to believe that as a child I threw this generation to the side as if it were any less of the Pokemon world that I was such a fan of. There were now new ways to find and train my Pokemon, and of course, new Pokemon for me to dub as some of my favorites. The second generation was no worse than the first just because I wasn't playing as Red, or by the fact that I didn't have my trusty Charmander at my side. Instead, I was given the opportunity for a new adventure with new friends and allies. Every generation of Pokemon is its own journey, with features that may come and go and brand new Pokemon species that may seem wacky and otherworldly, but along the way you'll make new memories, face new challenges, and add all sorts of new experiences to your personal catalog. The discoveries made along the way in Gold and Silver began these traditions of trying something new and mixing it with the old things we know and love, and that is what's so great about Pokemon's second generation. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we mastered the Johto region of Pokemon's second generation. Make sure to tell us what you think about Pokemon Gen 2, or even suggest a game for another video. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Castlevania, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.